Who in the world would have imagined at the beginning of the season of this first year of the 12-team college football playoff that we've all anticipated that the great debate would be between Alabama and SMU? Welcome into the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by on the eve of the unveiling of the final college football playoff rankings, the ones that count following Saturday's championship games in which Alabama sat out as a 9-3 football team. And of course, SMU went all the way to the wire. We're down 17 in the fourth quarter, lost to Clemson on a 56-yard field goal at the gun, and therefore they've got to sweat it out for a trip to the college football playoff at 11-2. And we're also going to introduce another team into the equation that should be safely in the playoff, but I think it's being assumed, and it should not be. It needs to be examined. Let's keep these things in mind. Whether I believe these to be right or fair, I guess it doesn't matter. What matters is what the committee says. And what the committee says is that they are not holding these teams accountable for their conference championship game appearance. They also say that they are freezing the resumes of the teams that did not play over the weekend, meaning that Alabama's win over Georgia does not get enhanced by Georgia defeating one of the best teams in the country again in Texas and winning the SEC championship game. Otherwise, if you're truly evaluating the teams based on the entirety of the season, in which they should be, and this is where the committee contradicts itself and is not honest and isn't disingenuous with its evaluation, it should be evaluating the resumes all the way up through the end of this season. If they're evaluating, which automatically they are, the conference championship games for the winners, obviously they're evaluating those games because the winners are, in fact, gaining automatic entry into the playoffs, and 4 of them a bye in the first round. Then they are actually evaluating, or should be, the losers of those games as well. It should be another data point. It should be evaluated, although I do get the point that teams should not have it held against them in a large degree that they made the conference championship game and may have been embarrassed. But we didn't have that this weekend, as Penn State looked good against Oregon despite losing, and SMU again went to the final second of the game against number 17, Clemson. But that's what the committee's saying. Resumes are frozen for the teams that did not play, and conference championship game results will not be held against anyone. Let's match up Bama and SMU. First, the losses. Bama's got bad losses. We all know it. Oklahoma 6-6, lost by 21 points on the road, and Bama only scored 3 points. The Vandy lost by 5. They never led in that game. Vandy finished 6-6, and then, of course, Bama lost to Tennessee, one of the best teams in the country, a 10-2 football team, lost on the road by 7. SMU's losses don't look bad at all. They, of course, again, lost on the last play of the game tonight on a long field goal to Clemson by 3 points. Keep in mind that Clemson has not defeated any good football teams. And then SMU also lost in September to BYU outside the conference. At the time, we had no idea that BYU would go deep into the season as an undefeated football team, finish at 10-2, and SMU played that game with 2023 starting quarterback Preston Stone as the starter. He faltered and was replaced by Kevin Jennings, the guy that led SMU on this incredible run throughout the remainder of the ACC season. Now let's look at the wins. Bama's got 4 strong wins. Georgia, 42-34, the 11-2 SEC champions. They beat South Carolina by 2, a team that is gaining all sorts of great evaluations by people who are impressed by South Carolina's closing run. Bama beat them 27-25, a 9-3 football team. Bama beat Mizzou, and yes, Mizzou's been knocked as not having one of the better schedules in the SEC, but Mizzou still went 9-3 and beat some good football teams, and Bama beat Mizzou by 34, minus starting quarterback Brady Cook for the Tigers. Speaking of the Tigers, Bama, 4 touchdowns better than LSU in Death Valley. The other wins aren't so impressive, but they some of them should be noted here. The Auburn win, winning against a rival by a couple touchdowns, going to Wisconsin and defeating the Badgers by 32 points. Wisconsin's not a good football team at 5-7, but keep in mind, Oregon went there and barely scratched out a win, 16-13. Penn State went there and was only up 14-13 late in the game. So Bama went there and beat down Wisconsin, which they should do by 32 points, something Penn State and Oregon could not do. Western Kentucky went to their conference championship game. Bama beat them by 63. And there are the wins against South Florida and against an 11-2 Mercer team out of the FCS. For SMU, the wins aren't nearly as impressive. Duke's the best win record-wise. The Blue Devils finished at 9-3. That game went to overtime. SMU beat Louisville in a shootout, and then they beat some 8-4 and 7-5 teams in TCU, Boston College, and Pitt. And then we could also note the games against Cal and Virginia. What's impressive about the wins against Cal and Virginia is not that those teams are that difficult to beat, but SMU disposed of them rather easily. Beat Cal by 32, had Virginia in a shutout until just a few seconds left in the game. Bama's strength of schedule stands at number 16, SMU at number 60 in college football. And actually, there's another team that is considered to be a shoo-in for the college football playoff that plays in one of the two true power conferences that is not being talked about as a bubble team. Their strength of schedule, SMU at 60, this team at number 68, introducing Indiana. Let's take a look at this. Indiana's 11-1, and they have outstanding game control. Excellent game control. They also did not schedule anyone out of conference. Their out-of-conference schedule is horrendous. FIU, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. So they can't be blamed for their conference schedule. They didn't schedule the conference. That was handed to them by the Big Ten. However, they did play the games, and we have to evaluate how bad the schedule is against Indiana's game control, which is outstanding again. Indiana's best wins against Michigan at home by 5 points. They dominated Nebraska. The Huskers had the same record as Michigan with 7 wins, but of course Michigan beat Ohio State, which is by far the most impressive win in the conference, basically the entire season. So Michigan's the best win, and again, that was only a 5-point win at home. They beat Nebraska by 7 touchdowns. That's impressive. The game control's impressive here by Indiana. They beat these teams into submission by and large. And if you would have told me at the beginning of the season that Indiana would go 11-1, I would have thought that there would be a lot of scoop and scores late in the ball game, deflected interceptions, field goals hitting off the crossbar to get them to this magical 11-1 season. But no, they dominated these bad teams. And yes, they are bad teams. Michigan State 47-10, Maryland by 3 touchdowns. A Maryland team that has been decent, 7-5, 8-5 teams the last 3 years, but 1-8 in the Big Ten this year. And what about that final game against Purdue? Well, Purdue is atrocious, but Indiana beat them 66-0. So we just know that Indiana can waste a lot of bad teams. And they've got the 68th ranked strength of schedule. SMU at 60, Indiana at 68. And, of course, the Hoosiers in their showdown, the one proving ground, their one shot to beat somebody good, they went to Columbus and lost 38-15. Now, on one hand, they only trailed 14-7 at half. It was a slow death in the second half. They were clearly dominated. They were clearly not up to the challenge, but they didn't get annihilated, blown out. It wasn't 28-0 in the first quarter. And so they hung with the Buckeyes to a certain extent, but again, way outclassed by Ohio State by 23. So let's weigh the pros and cons. And for Bama, it's quite easy. They've got the best wins by far against these other two teams. With the wins against Georgia, South Carolina, Missouri, and LSU, Bama's got the best wins. They've got the 16th rated schedule in the country, which is far better than SMU and Indiana's schedules. But the cons for Alabama, obvious. They've got the worst losses. So if you're looking for a team that is consistent, don't look at Alabama. But if you're looking for a team that on its best night can compete with legitimate playoff teams, then Bama's your team. The pros for the Mustangs, their record 11-2. They went to the ACC championship game, so they've got an extra game played, an extra data point. They put their necks on the line in a championship game, and they took it down to the wire, the last play of the game. They've got wins against 6 bowl teams. 5 of them have winning records, so they beat a lot of okay, decent, marginally decent teams like Pitt and Boston College and the like. They lost to BYU without their starting quarterback playing. And they only lost 18-15 against BYU. So that's a decent loss. It's not an embarrassing loss. And again, the game control is pretty high for SMU as well. Indiana outscored its FBS opponents by 277 points. SMU outscored its FBS opponents by 174 points. The knock against SMU is they have no huge wins. Duke and Louisville are the best teams they beat. They had a shot against Clemson. They had a shot against BYU, but they could not get it done against the 2 best teams on their schedule, and they lost both of those games, albeit very close. Now to the pros for Indiana. They've got the best record of the 3, 11-1. Number 2, they play in a better conference than SMU, and they had game control against those teams. And you could say to a certain extent that because they play in a better conference than the ACC, that those records by those Big Ten teams could be slightly better if those teams had played in another conference. And then, of course, Indiana had game control, dominating these teams by 4 and 5 touchdowns. UCLA, Nebraska, Michigan State, Maryland, all those games complete blowouts. The cons for Indiana, they've got the worst strength of schedule out of the 3 at number 68. They've got no good wins. Their best wins against Michigan. You could consider that a decent win. I would, but they won the game in less than convincing fashion, racking up only 18 yards of total offense in the second half on 25 plays, as Michigan outplayed them in the second half. So they got 2 quick touchdowns against Michigan, led 17-3, then got outplayed in the second half. And lastly, while Indiana is safely in the field of 12 at number 10, and of course they played neither team participating in the Big Ten championship game, so their resume is basically frozen. They're not missing the playoff. They've got a huge con against them that could have been held against them throughout the season. And that's while they had no control over their awful Big Ten schedule, in which they did not play Oregon, Iowa, Penn State, or some of the better teams in the Big Ten. They scheduled 3 completely lousy teams outside the conference. They did have control over their non-conference schedule, and they refused to schedule anybody. Nobody in the Power 5, nobody even decent in the Group of 5. Charlotte was their best scheduled game. All right, we lined up Alabama, SMU, and also Indiana. When they're playing their best, Alabama's the best football team. SMU has been the most consistent football team, and Indiana, the most consistent team against bad opponents. SMU has played better against better opponents, the Louisvilles, the Dukes, the Boston Colleges, and Pitts, and Clemson, and BYU. So they've played pretty well against just a variety of top 25 to 30 type teams in the country, while Indiana has beaten down a lot of Nebraskas and Purdue's and Michigan State's and Maryland's and the like, UCLA as well. Bama's the best team with the best talent and the best resume when you look at the wins. They should be in the college football playoff. SMU, though, if we're simply looking at what the College Football Playoff Committee unveiled and showed us going into this weekend, with SMU at number 8, Bama at 11, SMU should not be penalized and dropped out of the playoff for losing on the last play of the game on a 56-yard field goal, in which they had just completely outplayed Clemson in the fourth quarter in the second half to get to a tie football game against the 9-3 football team. So based on the committee's rankings, they need to keep SMU in. Based on my evaluation, I got Bama above SMU. And actually, Indiana's resume is not playoff worthy, but at 11-1, of course, they're in. Hope that makes sense. Leave your comments and questions below. Catch us for the watch party, noon Eastern time, here on Sunday. Let's watch it together, and we'll take your calls right here at the Voice of College Football.